labour, but that labour market doesn't do what it needs to do, which is why we need to think radically about social policy. This is about support, right? So we've been asking a question about society and what's their reaction. I mean, there is support for redistribution at least. I mean, Australia's to pride itself in New Zealand about being egalitarian societies, meaning in plain English that they're fair countries, we like to treat people fairly. So some of this still resonates, right, in the sense that the support for being distributed about both wealth and in terms of income inequality, there is support for that at around 50%, around 20% of people should leave things as they are and let the market work it out. Income inequality in New Zealand is a similar story. You can see the top 1% is the top line there that's pulling away. That's in hundreds of thousands in terms of their income. So average there's around 400,000. We're at the bottom, you're pumping around $10,000, $12,000 in the bottom 10%. And the flat line indicates the same story as Australia, so the trend line is very similar. All right, so this is, when you talk about the future, you can say what you like, because no one really knows what's going to happen. And this is where the debate gets interesting, because there are lots of futurists, and I've been talking in lots of forums in Australia about this. We get excited about the potential of robotics and AI and so on in terms of creating lots of time and temporal time, which is an important notion of justice, for us to do things that previously we might have had trouble with if it was, slaves doing it, but we may not have a problem in terms of robots doing all that drudgery. So there are a lot of people who are interested in this. And what a lot of labour market economists disagree about is the time frame. So no one disagrees that it's going to happen, that there is displacement. Where they disagree is about the time frame and where the jobs, of course, will be recreated that the ones that are lost. Anyway, in that debate, I land on the side that we may not know, but let's be prepared for it. Otherwise, it's going to be a pretty crappy transition, right? If you want a just transition in that notion, that concept, then we need to prepare for the fact that this kind of automation is going to eat into occupations that have previously been untouched, that weren't touched by industrial or in terms of the agricultural revolution and automation spheres. And the other graph just shows what's already happened. It's going to decline. This is the forecast about New Zealand. I don't know where the source is, so forgive me for that. Just showing estimating the number of positions, actual positions that will be lost in terms of automation in New Zealand. And yes, managers and professional classes, the creative classes of the knowledge economy, yes, it's reduced, but there still is an impact in the tens of thousands as well as these I teach in universities, and there are programs and software and algorithms now that are running experimental tutorials, for example, and they can answer most student questions, except when they ask them what the reading is. So it's impacting both computers, also writer science for students, but computers can also do a lot of some of the teaching. And anyone who's involved in education, MOOCs and so on, will know that the twixt in between the kind of online and offline in-person education. This is something I've started to do research on now, is Ubers, the Airtaskers, all these Deliveroos that are breaking up work in very fragmented ways. Richard Sennett, the sociologist at work, has also been thinking about this, because he said that previously we had full-time jobs and people in low-skilled jobs, there was a clear kind of connection between the sacrifice and the reward. Yes, you're told, yes, it wasn't very high status, but you've got some social mobility for your kids, you had some income there for retirement, because you paid your taxes and your dues and so on. That sacrifice and reward doesn't work in the same way in these kinds of what the so-called gig economy, right? Because all the task is what is itemised in people in the big four. So that relationship doesn't hold anymore. So status is something that's also being done in these new forms of work. I've been trying to get into Uber in Queensland and having discussions with the drivers. I mean, it's fascinating, because the Uber company refers to them as driver partners, they're their partners. At the same time, Uber's hired 7,000 engineers to, of course, move towards the driverless car. That's where they're investing their profits, not in the workers. They take $2.50 every 2 years. The workers still have the same complaints. They still want more of that cut than they do. And so it's interesting in terms of demands and offers to so much from the workers. But that what the companies are doing, they're not investing in future workers, they're investing, of course, in AI, algorithms, engineers, to move them much more forward to this future. Let alone all the ethical issues that are associated with this. Right? Just the driver's car for itself in terms of who it protects. The Mercedes-Benz that you drive to protect the driver, not the person walking down the street, not the cyclist, because it's a person who hard, even though a person indicates it not much better. There's all sorts of interesting issues about this. Also in terms of the transition again, what it means for people both cars being driven by people and automated cars. There are 70 million transport workers worldwide. Okay, that's a really high minuscule to automation. 70 million transport workers are potentially not have working language to do that. How do they get treated? I think there's a whole bunch of socio-legal, and I've got colleagues in industrial relations that look into this as well, around holiday pay, leave, sick leave, all of those sorts of conditions. And the British case is interesting because it said to Uber to claim that they're not employees is simply ridiculous. Simply ridiculous. That, of course, the challenge by the government is to what the numbers. Standing in his most recent book has talked about the whole volunteer class, but there's nothing that's been owned here. It's the technology, it's the software. Airbnb, for example, don't own any houses, but really they're the ones that are letting the most houses around the world on a short-term basis. Alright, so this is where you either get the fear or the fascination of people writing about this. Tim Dunlop is in the middle, he's an Australian author. He says we should embrace this future because it really can mean that we go back to doing things that create meaningful life in that kind of the sense that Bowman talks about. Doing things other than being fully centred around how work ethic has the measure of whether we're a social citizen and the contribution we make, in the same way that Tua was just talking about in his presentation, up against the ethic of care, for example. So he's embracing it, and I've done book launches with Tim, and it's interesting he shows up at these, right? Because it's often parents with kids who are thinking about sending to university to know where the university's working. What are we going to teach at the university if machines are going to be better at thinking than we are? If we thought about ourselves as cognitive, then we need to think about ourselves in terms of other ways. And yes, it will be some of those creative endeavours, the arts, for example, may potentially thrive, which could sound to lots of struggling artists like in Australia who join the recognition. There's other proposals in Australia. This is by the Green Institute, Less Working, More Fair. So not just UBI, but shorter working hours, while in the Sweden model of 6-hour working days, which they've been trialling in some nursing homes. The issue is, of course, who pays for it. All in a nursing home, we still provide 24-hour care. These aren't simple equations, but I think they're at least interested in what we can do with short working hours, because we know that productivity doesn't work every 9 hour day. It's much better than a 5-6 hour day. So that's part of the package, but I think the limitation of the shorter working week, by the way, is that it's dealing with the present conditions, not the future. What UBI tries to do is be an adaptive technology in the same way that climate change. What shorter working weeks is a mitigation. It's about current. It's trying to redistribute all those hours that people are doing too much work to those who have too few hours. That's not going to be the issue in the future. It's going to be how we get through the position of people have no hours, potentially. And as I said earlier, we've edited to say that we've been focusing on this. I mentioned how the think tanks are playing a role, because I want to talk now about policy actors. And there's a range. Even on the conservative side, there's the sort of libertarian versus the social conservative think tanks in Australia. The socially conservative think tank, which is the Centre for Independent Studies, really hates UBI. Has been doing every bit it can in the news at the moment, the media, writing op-ed pieces to say this is a really big waste of money. It costs you $300 billion a year, which is equivalent to the whole world budget. And you could do that much more efficiently. You should get to those that in need. That's the kind of their argument. They're making that very persuasively on the airwaves. The Institute for Public Affairs, however, much more libertarian, thinks that this is the way to the smaller state, because you've got such a complicated, messy, administratively operating workless. And so you've got, even on the right, think tanks taking quite different stands in terms of UBI in Australia. Political parties, with the Greens, both New Zealand and Australia, are kind of on board, but they're quite timid. I mean, they've been trying to capture the centre. They're not learning from the Netherlands, where they've been quite successful looking to the left, as we just saw in terms of the recent election there. They're trying to capture some of the centre. So they'll have it in the policy platforms, but they're not out and proud of that. They're not out there in terms of the election.
She has times.
They're not out and proud about it, but that's the parties that have in the Constitution, which I think the Labor Party should be the party that takes us forward. But the Labor Party leadership is really on the same old mantra of jobs and growth, jobs and growth, jobs and growth. Leading in a kind of back to the future arguments Tim Dunlop says they're going to create the jobs. And they're really not. I mean, we're not producing cars anymore in Australia, that's what this year. The manufacturing sector is in huge decline. Nonetheless, at the branch level of these political parties, particularly in some states, there's a motions being passed for UBI. They want to take it to the state conference. So some of that kind of attention is moving up, but the leadership of the major parties has been shutting it down as much as possible. All right, this is what I said. You can think about the higher roads, the low roads to UBI. You can do the incremental things. You can start small, and I've been to lots of BN conferences where that's discussed, as well as start with one part of the population, seen as most deserving, children, elderly, and so on. That's one way to do it. But if you learn something from Obamacare, it is that when you do things and make those reforms, you also create resistance as you go. And this is the point that Stone makes, right? Is that you kind of, every step you make, now they want more, now they want more. So I think there's a danger also in incrementalism, despite the fact that both Australia and New Zealand, that's how they tend to do social works. It's really only been wars and depressions, external shocks that have radically equalised income and built foundations of welfare states. So what's the crisis event for the 21st century to modernise the welfare state? Yes, it might be automation. It certainly has got to be in terms of the ecological argument. Do I need a new welfare state? We can't have jobs and growth unless we want to have another form of work. It doesn't work. And the whole eco-social policy is an interesting area of scholarship, which taps into some of these utopian ideas. But I take Eric Golden Rights quite seriously too. We need to start with conditions of the present, not imagine some political intervention. What are the struggles in the language we're talking about feminism and so on? That's the sort of utopia, the real utopias that Eric Golden Rights talks about. I think that's really important. And the utopias are also a way of getting measured from the existing state of affairs. And I talked about the horrible kind of social security policies that we've got and the consequences of those, and I've done lots of research long-term and empirically, and the disrespect that goes along with not just the material problem, but the misrecognition problems. Anything you're talking about that's so different to that provides a measure of which to judge that. And that's why UBI is important in terms of an idea, is that gives that capacity to judge things. If you're so enmeshed in it, that's the advantage of comparative work and research. If you're so enmeshed in it, you don't see that there's an alternative. Questions. So we've just got some money for the Australian Academy of Social Sciences. They give you about $10,000, not just with scholars, but with activists, policymakers. And the next stage is not just turning up at town halls or forums, because we're doing a lot of that in Australia, but how do you move it in terms